So let's jump right in with an easy and simple question. And by that, of course, I mean it's neither easy nor simple. Really, social media and the internet in general, if you look back 15, 20 years maybe at the conversation, we all expected them to bring freedom and liberty and transparency to the world, and especially to those places that maybe didn't have that yet in quite as big numbers. Yet in countries like the ones we mentioned, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Myanmar, all of which you have reported on, really what social media seems to be doing mostly is incite political hatred, division, and ethnic violence. So I guess the question we could start with is, what went wrong?
Yeah, I like the way that you frame this question. I think it's interesting to sort of bookend this discussion with the Arab Spring, the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa that we know as the Arab Spring, and how we thought about social media in that era. I think the kind of common perception in that era was that platforms like Twitter and Facebook would have this kind of democratizing influence, would elevate voices and discussions that otherwise would have been blocked out by, heavily censored legacy media, for instance, including like newspapers and TV, would allow people to organize in a way that they had never been able to do before and with sort of a speed that they had never been able to do before. And it's not that all of that stuff was wrong. Like, there was a lot of truth to it. And there still is a lot of truth to that. But I think that what has happened in the years since then is that authoritarian governments and other kind of malicious actors have figured out how to sort of use and weaponize these platforms in ways that benefit them. So to me, they've done this in sort of two forms. One is coordinated disinformation campaigns that are aimed to either disrupt the flow of real information, sort of sow doubt in the minds of people over good information and over institutions like independent media and civil society, and also to sort of manipulate platforms so that their kind of own inbuilt content moderation tools are used to further the aims of censorship and suppressing kind of critical information about governments. So I think that even in the context of all this, social media platforms can and are being used for kind of positive aims to help people kind of communicate to broader audiences. And I can give some examples of that later on. But I think the kind of upshot of it is that we have these kind of like handful of huge companies, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, probably TikTok now, and a couple of others that have become these incredibly important and powerful stewards of speech and information around the world, often in countries that have kind of little business significance to those companies. And as stewards, they've done that with a remarkably low level of transparency and accountability. Because they're coming out of this culture of Silicon Valley and of kind of multinational companies in general, where their kind of primary aim is their own sustenance, is of growth and of kind of profit and revenue for them, and kind of not acting towards this kind of greater social good. So if they were kind of ordinary companies, that might be fine. But when you're in a situation where these companies are acting essentially as a public comment or a public good that is sort of the keeper of speech in many places around the world, you kind of have a greater level of responsibility that these companies are only now starting to recognize and sort of try to live up to in different ways. So yeah, I think that's sort of a good way to frame this discussion.
So it seems to me that the issue we're talking about, and we can talk in a minute about what we're actually going to call it. There seems like some definitional issues here as well. But really, this is not something, hate speech, political disinformation, ethnic violence, or like calls for ethnic violence and discrimination. This is nothing. None of this is new. This has literally existed since the dawn of humanity, and media, whatever sort of the preferred type of media was at the time, have been used to do that. So, yeah. Aren't we in a way sort of overstating the problem as it is today isn't, sort of, is this less maybe a problem of social media and more an issue of sort of almost something that's been around forever, moving to the preferred type of medium of today? Would you say that social media has in a way made it worse, or at least made it, fundamentally different from how it was before?
It's a good question. I think I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a couple of things that are different about social media compared to sort of the way that hate speech has been disseminated in the past. The kind of I guess a very kind of telling example of the dissemination of hate speech leading to actual violence were the radio stations in Rwanda that were broadcasting calls to massacre the Tutsis, like sort of right before the genocide actually started. And this is something that they were doing brazenly in public. They made absolutely clear exactly what they were going to do, and then people did it. And in fact, the proprietors of those radio stations were later tried in international courts, and I believe they were convicted as well. So what's interesting about that is that there was a kind of accountability mechanism that happened later that you would not have expected to have happened in Rwanda itself, but there was some method of accountability there. So I think the thing that's interesting about social media is that, again, we're talking about companies that all basically live in California. Like, these companies are subject to kind of laws in the United States and are subject, in sort of to a different extent in to laws in sort of other parts of the world that sort of varies in terms of where their businesses are located, as well as how those governments actually manage and enforce those laws. So I think that's one question, like sort of where does the accountability lie? In the case of Cambodia, the opposition leader of Cambodia is currently trying to take Facebook to a California court to get them to disclose information about whether the current leader of Cambodia has used inauthentic likes on to kind of artificially promote his message on Facebook, with Facebook sort of knowing and allowing him to do that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, as we all know, platforms like Facebook and Twitter, they've made this sort of claim to neutrality, the kind of neutrality of content that has been really key in how they are regulated by laws that would, and regulations that would govern the media. So essentially they say, we're not making decisions about what goes on our platforms. You, the user, create the content. It goes on our platform, and all content is created equal, and all content is sort of neutral, and we are just sort of the conveyance. So like the analogy would be, they are not a news program, rather they are, they're like the Post or something. They're just conveying the information. So that obviously has proven to be false, as anyone who remembers the kind of 2016 election in the US will recall. These platforms are sort of increasingly using algorithms and also human moderation to decide what kind of content and information gets promoted, what people tend to see. All of these are sort of editorial functions in the traditional sense. So on the one hand, you have the platform saying, no, actually, we're not like traditional media. If there is hate speech on our platforms that leads to real world violence, it's the fault of the user that created the hate speech and not on us. And I think what we've seen in the past few years is that that has really changed in a very sharp way. And the third thing I would point out is just the speed of information. I think that obviously, like, if something's on a radio broadcast, it's also like a pretty quick speed. But I think like because there's like sort of very little filtering of content on Facebook and Twitter, particularly in languages that have few speakers and are not, that don't have a Roman alphabet, there's sort of very limited content moderation still. And what you end up seeing is that bad actors that are trying to weaponize these platforms to kind of cause violence in real life, to incite violence, they're able to do it at a speed that is much faster than what content moderators, can get to. So in Myanmar, for instance, famously, there were lots of groups, both right-wing groups within Myanmar, as well as, even sitting lawmakers and people in government functions that were using Facebook to write in Myanmar and other minority languages to basically say, Rohingya Muslims they are the enemy, they are foreigners, comparing them to insects. This is the language of genocide. And they were able to do that much more quickly than Facebook's content moderators were able to get to them. And I think that's for a number of factors that we can get into. But it sort of shows the power of these platforms and how the company has always sort of been one or two steps behind the people that have sought to weaponize them.
And I'd love to talk about a few of those issues afterwards in more detail, but maybe before that, I think there's one issue that maybe we haven't discussed yet, which may contribute to the problem, which is that in many of those countries you've mentioned, whether that's Cambodia, whether that's Myanmar, many of the other places, one challenge is also that Facebook is so widespread. So Facebook in many of those places, and to me, it seems like in stark contrast to European countries, US countries, but also in stark contrast, for example, to places like China, of course, Facebook has become the de facto internet. So for a lot of the people, using the internet is the equivalent of using Facebook. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little about sort of why that happened. So why was Facebook essentially able to get such a complete hold on people's online experiences in some countries, but not in others?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are like a few answers to this, but the two that I think are most compelling is like, basically, in some countries, you see this kind of leapfrogging effect of the internet. So I think in the developed world, most of us got internet on our computers first. You had like a dial-up modem and that sort of thing on your personal computer, and that's how you got the internet. And that's, at least for me, that's how I got on Facebook first. And it was only like years later that I downloaded the app. So you take a place like Myanmar. Myanmar is a very stark example because it was quite a closed society until about, I think around like 2010, 2011, that time period. And then it sort of started to open up very slowly. So around that time, if you wanted a SIM card in Myanmar, it was like exorbitant. It was probably like $100 or something, like $70 to $100, something like that. And, if you look at the per capita income in Myanmar, that essentially means it wasn't going to be accessible to you. So essentially, the people that were using the internet, they were going to use it like in a dial-up style, in an internet cafe, and that was it. So some people did make Facebook accounts then. But what changed was essentially Myanmar started opening up. Democracy sort of came to the country pretty quickly. And kind of part and parcel of that was that the internet stopped being so heavily sort of censored and regulated, and the price of SIM cards just crashed. So like now you can get a SIM card for like a few bucks there. And a lot of people would describe to me that they would buy like sort of cheap Androids, and kind of one of the first apps that they would get would be Facebook. So Facebook is like really useful for them because it's like, I think they sort of accessed it first in that app format. And if you think about the way apps work, they're like all apps on your phone are sort of playing at the same level. Like you don't have to start with search the way that you would the way that you would if you were on a desktop. So for instance, I have a friend who's an internet trainer in Myanmar. She does like internet literacy trainings, and she was doing one of these trainings, and one of the questions that she always asks is, like for her students to sort of find out a certain piece of information. So it would be like, what's the capital of Switzerland or something. So if it were you or me, what we might do is Google it if we didn't know the answer to that question. But if you're a person that got on the internet primarily through Facebook, what you would do, and what her students actually did, was they would go onto Facebook and they would use Facebook to search the answer to that question. Or they would use Facebook's messenger function to ask a friend that they thought was smart, what's the capital of Switzerland? Or they would do something sort of within the app. So like, it goes to show how much people actually rely on Facebook for that information. And then the second thing I would note is that in a number of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, and I think some in Africa as well, Facebook sort of rolled out this program called Free Basics. It was originally called Free Basics. Now I think it's called something else. But essentially the point was that people would have access to Facebook and different Facebook functions like Messenger and stuff like that without having to pay additionally to their mobile service provider. So there's sort of different versions of that still exist. Like I think in the Philippines and a few other countries in Southeast Asia, you get your mobile service provider, when you top up, you get you can get a bundle where essentially you can send Facebook messages for free. All of your time that you spend on the Facebook app is for free. And versus if you were just going to use your browser or some other app, you would have to pay like a data fee. So of course, then it's a no-brainer. You're just going to be on Facebook all the time. And for whatever reason, that didn't exist, or like it doesn't exist to the same extent, I think, in the West. Yeah.
Maybe before we kind of go further in addressing sort of the different dimensions of the problem, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about one concrete example. So as we've mentioned, you reported on a number of those countries and a number of those cases. And one of the, to me, most interesting story you've written was actually about Cambodia. And sort of I think you call it in the piece, you call it like the Breitbart of Cambodia. It's a website called Fresh News. So perhaps if you just, to sort of give us a little bit of an example and a little bit of color to these conversations, tell us the story of Fresh News and the role that it's playing in Cambodian politics. Perhaps you can also, I think the article is from 2017 or 18, maybe something has changed, so maybe you can talk about how the situation in Cambodia looks like today.
Yeah, I'll share my screen really briefly and just show you what it looks like. So essentially, so basically Fresh News, this is their Facebook page, if I can get it to load, it's essentially like a kind of super popular online news platform that is almost exclusively supportive of the Cambodian dictator, whose name is Hun Sen. So Hun Sen has been in power basically since like the 70s. I think he was in his 40s at the time, and he's sort of still in power. Cambodia was never a true democracy, but it had elections of varying competitiveness. I think up until like I think 2014 or something, and they were meant to have an election in 2018, and that was sort of the year that Hun Sen shut down all civil society, all independent media, all kind of political opposition. He jailed the opposition leader, and Fresh News played an interesting role in this because they sort of, they're like a kind of traditional state media outfit. But the thing that's different about them is that they have the kind of speed of the web. So they're using Facebook to push updates like kind of constantly to people. They do it in an incredibly propagandistic way. They sort of never criticize the government. And so when I went to Cambodia, I was really interested to talk to the guy who runs it. His name is Lim Chiavuta. He's this kind of like, I can't think if I have a photo of him here, but he's a kind of very young, I think probably like late 30s, founder of this site. He's so close to Hun Sen, the prime minister of Cambodia, that they text like late at night, and then Hun Sen, I guess, tells him what to post. And he has done an incredible amount of damage, I have to say. Like, he was sort of a comic figure because he's so self-obsessed. Like, he would sort of inflate the page views of his site to like kind of astronomical amounts that like don't make any sense. But he also sort of used the site to promote all of these conspiracy theories. So for instance, this is the Twitter profile of Monavitya Kem, who is the daughter of Cambodia's opposition leader, Kem Sokha, and is also an official in his party. And essentially, fake news, or sorry, fake news, Fresh News published kind of an article where they basically had gone through her Instagram and they had found all of the pictures that she had posted with like American friends of hers and stuff like that, mostly like white men, to be honest, because she had gone to, I believe she went to grad school at Georgetown, and she had all these friends who were American, and basically they used this to say that she was like a CIA plan or something like that. And, you can see here that she tweeted a joke about it with her sister saying like, oh yeah, I'm like James Bond. But sort of just a few weeks after she tweeted this, after the article came out, police showed up at her family's house and they arrested her father, who's, by the way, very sick. So he's out now. He's still under house arrest. He's not able to serve as opposition leader because the opposition has effectively been disbanded within Cambodia. Cambodia's democracy, whatever kind of hope of democracy they had, has sort of collapsed, unfortunately. And I think kind of the upshot of this is that Fresh News is, despite the fact that Fresh News has its own site and its own platform, it basically lives on Facebook because that's how Cambodians get information. Especially Cambodians of a certain age, like they would mostly get this info on Facebook, and even older Cambodians, it's sort of a growing share of how they get it. So essentially, Lim Chiavuta is using this portal to sort of broadcast bogus news that has really done a lot of harm to his society's democracy and civil institutions, and he's using this like American platform to be able to do that.
Let's maybe thank you for sort of this overview, and I do think it's worth checking out these pages, even if one as I doesn't speak or read Cambodian. It's just interesting to me that sort of they look like normal, legitimate news pages, and I guess in some ways they are, because probably some part of what they report is kind of just like good old news, but then it's kind of interspersed with these other stories. We did mention now this term fake news a couple of times, but you told me when we prepared for this that you have your issues with the term because you feel it's kind of loaded. And I had this challenge when we prepared the outline for today's conversation, that while I feel like I sort of understand what the issue is, I'm never quite sure what to call it. So I usually say it's like political disinformation on social media, but that feels kind of narrow. Hate speech to me is somewhat clearly defined, but I think part of the problem is that a lot of this isn't hate speech, which is why it's so hard to control and police and moderate. So is there a term, like how should we refer to that kind of insidious, but also in many ways somewhat subtle type of information, which isn't even necessarily wrong? It's not necessarily a lie, but it's taken out of context. It's sort of trying to produce a certain narrative. Can we put a label on it of some kind?
Yeah, it's really hard. I use the term fake news sometimes, and I shouldn't actually. I think it's actually a really ambiguous term. It's a term that is weaponized by pretty much everyone at this point. When Donald Trump tweets about fake news, it means something very different from, when somebody else talks about it. And no one's really defined these terms. I think for something to be defined as fake news, it has to be a fact. Like, it has to be something that can be proven true or false. It can't be sort of a point of opinion. That's one thing. But to your question about what should we call it? I think it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on, I think, who is creating the information and for what purpose. So I think this term, like political disinformation, is a good one for times when political actors or governments are using disinformation to push a certain agenda. So it might be that they're using it to convince people of a certain point of view, or they could be using it merely to create discord. And that's, of course, what we've seen in kind of Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda, both in Ukraine and Georgia, as well as, throughout the West. And we've seen other actors using the same kinds of techniques. You also at that point have misinformation, which has been, incredibly destructive in places like India. I know we don't want to get too deep into the coronavirus stuff, but I think that's sort of at the forefront of what we're all thinking about now. I think who hasn't gotten a WhatsApp message that has been forwarded hundreds of times saying that ginger can cure the coronavirus and that sort of thing. So this stuff is probably not, it's often not created with any malicious intent, but nonetheless, it can have really disastrous consequences. So the question is, as platforms that are being used to spread this kind of info, what kind of responsibility do they have to try to stop it, or do they have any responsibility at all? So I guess like the kind of broad answer to your question is, I don't think fake news as an umbrella term is necessarily that useful anymore, because it's been used like so much since 2016, and it means so many different things to different people. But when we're talking about how to name or categorize different kinds of false information or misinformation online, I think you have to just look at kind of the intent behind it and then who's putting it out there as well.
I want to at this point ask a question that's been submitted by somebody listening in, and thank you for that. And I want to take this opportunity to also remind everybody on the call that if you're listening in on Zoom, you can type your questions and we'll see them. And actually is a great follow-up question to what we've just discussed. The question is, can you comment on the increasing importance of large group chats and messaging services serving as news sources? So, whether that's Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, which of course is also owned by Facebook, or any other of those sort of messaging services. And you mentioned India before, where of course this was a very, very big issue during last year's election, where most of the sort of misinformation that was spread actually happened in private WhatsApp group, which made it even harder and more challenging to sort of moderate. So what's your assessment of the relative importance of those messaging services vis-a-vis more open and public platforms like Facebook in spreading political misinformation?
I think it's a really, really good question. I think it presents a big challenge for these companies. That being said, I think there are sort of some ways to try to address it, some of which have been taken and others that haven't. I think the broader context for this is that a lot of, the person who raised the question pointed out, a lot of the kind of discussions that we have are moving off of these public platforms and into group chats. Some of them are massive group chats with like hundreds of people and stuff like that, which essentially means they're in kind of a semi-private sphere that makes it a lot harder for the companies in some cases to sort of regulate or moderate in the way that they would if they were on a public platform. And this is doubly true in places like China, where there's really heavy censorship on public platforms. So stuff that you can write on Weibo, which is sort of the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, it's like a microblogging platform. Some of that stuff would be censored within like a couple seconds, but you would have a relative amount of freedom to post that stuff to your friends on WeChat, although WeChat also limits the size of groups and they take sort of other measures to prevent the spread of certain kinds of information. So in that situation, you'd probably be incentivized, or you would have a sense of a kind of greater level of protection or privacy when you're sharing just with friends, versus on the internet. So, you might be right or you might be wrong on that. Of course, there are people that have been arrested for, stuff that they've posted on group chats in China, but, that's sort of the calculus for a lot of individual users. In the rest of the world outside of China is kind of super censored internet that is largely home to its own ecosystem of platforms. The same kind of dynamics apply. Like in Egypt, for instance, I was in Egypt last year talking to some people about some of the protests that took place last year. And I think that one kind of striking difference is that if you look back to the protests at Tahrir Square, a lot of the organization happened in plain sight on Twitter. And you could see people saying, let's meet at this place, let's meet at this time. And if you look at the way that the very few demonstrations that happen in Egypt are organized now, you won't see anything on Twitter, because it's like incriminating yourself. Like, you're saying in public, like, let's organize at this time. Nobody's going to do that. So was that stuff happening on private messaging groups? I don't know, but like, it's really hard to say. But the fact is that people are organizing, and the way that we communicate now is primarily digital. So if you look at services like WhatsApp and Signal, those services are incredibly important in those contexts, because A, they're encrypted, and B, the data doesn't live in those countries, right? Like, whatever data there is, like in WhatsApp, in the question of, in WhatsApp, that would just be like metadata. So it would be like the time that you sent the message and who you sent it to. Even that data it's not going to live in Egypt. It'll live probably in California somewhere, right? And so, and Facebook has probably, I would assume, a little bit more discretion in complying with government requests for information in places like Egypt versus somewhere like California, for better or for worse. That's the way it is. So if you're a person that's organizing a demonstration in a place like Egypt, that's actually really positive for you. But then if you flip it, what happens, like in India, for instance, where there's a lot of misinformation that's being spread on these group chats, but the content of the messages is encrypted. So if it's encrypted, it means that the company is not viewing the content of the messages, right? So like, if you're WhatsApp or Signal, you have that additional level of privacy, and that's why a lot of people actually choose those services. But if you have that situation, then how is the company supposed to regulate things like weaponized disinformation, like calls for violence, for instance, that happens all the time on WhatsApp groups, disinformation about health and things like that can be really harmful. So there are some people that have like sort of worked on these problems. I think one thing that people have said to me is that it helps to sort of limit the amount that you can forward. So if something's being forwarded to thousands of people very quickly, that's something that the company can see and they can act on without compromising the actual information itself. I believe that WhatsApp has also started to label information that has been forwarded lots. So that's one way to sort of do this. Another way to do it is sort of like reporting and expanding the capability of people to report bad information. Another thing that companies do is like for things like images and videos, they have what's called a hash database. So every piece of multimedia content has a kind of signifier in code, and all of that is kept in a database. So the companies have primarily used this to combat child pornography, and they've been doing this for a very long time because, of course, there are a lot of very strict laws on child pornography, and they have to comply with those laws. So, for instance, if I'm posting, a video like a child pornographic video, I can't then change the name of the file and then repost it, the same video again. It will be caught by this database. So the question is, can they broaden this for other kinds of content? So there's lots of kind of, these things are also fraught. There's also issues around transparency of these databases and what makes it on, what makes it off. I wrote a bit about how they're used to target videos like ISIS beheadings and stuff like that. The question is, can this be used for sort of other kinds of misinformation, disinformation? So those are just some ideas, but it sort of gives you a sense of the nature of the problem and what's being done to combat it.
I want to talk, this is not the focus of our conversation today, but I do want to talk just briefly about China, because you've spent significant time in the country, and it's always struck me that China's kind of, in this respect, as in so many other respects, kind of a world unto its own, in a sense that it seems like sort of that type of problem that we've talked mostly about today in terms of kind of political misinformation, rumors, inciting violence and hatred, seems much less of an issue on Chinese social media, precisely because they're so controlled and precisely because they're heavily censored. Of course, there's many other issues on Chinese internet. There's many issues you can talk about. Posting something in private message groups can result in a call of the police, but still how would you assess the sort of the specific issue in China? Is it really less problematic, and is it because of the censorship or because something else, or is it there and it's just not visible to us because the ecosystem is essentially more closed off?
I think the latter. I think the notion that their targeting of misinformation has been more effective than anywhere else is like, I think it's not true. Anyone who reads Chinese social media will tell you there's a lot of misinformation on Chinese social media. And it's pretty clear like why this happens. It's because first of all, there's just a lot of internet users in China, and you need like to police for misinformation. Like at this point in our technological development, you need a person to do it. It's very hard to train an algorithm to be able to do that. And like the Silicon Valley companies have found that, and the Chinese tech companies have probably found that as well. So to moderate that much content, you need a lot of people, right? But the way that Chinese social media platforms work is that they have to prioritize what content that they're actually going to take down. And the way these processes work is that a lot of times you'll get a request for censorship from some arm of the government. It might not be the central government. It might just be like your local commerce bureau. It can be anybody. And you sort of decide whether to act on that. Sometimes companies will ask. It's all kind of like very disparate in some ways. And in addition to that, you might sort of get lists of words that like, or like kind of like things that you already know are off limits that you're going to take off anyway. So like supposing I'm on Weibo calling for Taiwanese independence, that's obviously like a red flag. That's been a red flag for a very long time in China. So that sort of stuff, in my opinion, tends to get prioritized over other kinds of forms of misinformation that would possibly be sort of less harmful to the government. So that being said, they do police for misinformation also. So like, to sort of varying degrees of success. So like, for instance, if somebody is making sort of bogus health claims or, that sort of thing, they're quite sensitive to, because there have been so many scandals around kind of consumer products and stuff like that, like tainted milk powder, tainted rice, all that sort of thing. So you do get a lot of people that are making kind of health claims and stuff like that are really bad. Obviously you get, just like anywhere else, like you do get people calling for violence and stuff on these platforms, just like any other country in the world, like that kind of stuff they do police for, but I think it's important, and we've sort of already alluded to this, like when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, it's not something that should be relegated to just users. So in China, one of the biggest sources of disinformation is like state media. So what are you going to do about that, right? They have a law that is essentially it's called an anti-rumor law. It like far predates like 2016 and like kind of our current conversation about quote unquote fake news, but it has been used to essentially stop a lot of people that have just been critical of the government online. But if you're going to have an anti-rumor law that is supposed to be targeting misinformation, then you have to also apply it to like official actors as well that are spreading misinformation. And like, without fail, I don't think it ever once has been. In China now, you have senior government officials, people that are high-ranking foreign ministry officials. You have the Global Times, which is a state media outlet, and you even have the People's Daily, which is the official mouthpiece of the Communist Party, essentially saying the coronavirus was started in the US and that it was used to target China. And like, this is beyond what I would have ever imagined in my time that I lived there. And it just shows how much worse the discourse has become between China and the US. But I mean, even setting that aside, this is very clear-cut misinformation. There's no like kind of evidence behind this whatsoever. And it's being broadcast to millions and millions of people in a closed information ecosystem where, and because it's so closed, that information is extraordinarily powerful. So I think anyone who is making the argument that China's kind of censorship mechanisms have made it easier or more effective for them to police misinformation, they sort of have to look at that first, I think. You have to take both of those two things together.
Let's talk a bit, you spoke now about, sort of the role of governments and sort of authorities, and obviously there are places in China, maybe one of them, where sort of the government or government-linked organizations have fairly good ways of broadcasting stuff, whatever that stuff is. But if you look again, so if we look at the Facebook issue, if you look at places like Cambodia and Myanmar, if you take the case of Fresh News would not have the influence it does have, and as you make the convincing argument in your piece, the overwhelmingly bad influence it has, were it not for the fact that a very large group of people is actively engaging with the content. So the question I'm trying to get at is, if we look at these disinformation, misinformation campaigns on social media, if you look at the ones that very often then create real world violence, how much of them are actually campaigns in the sense that they're being coordinated and sort of planned from a somewhat centralized place, and how much of it is sort of created spontaneously, through the willing support of a large sort of, general population without there being a centralized coordinating entity?
Yeah, I mean, it's different depending on where you go and the kind of type of information. You have cases where people are promoting violence and the government doesn't want it to be so. You have cases where people are promoting violence or spreading hate speech and the government sort of tacitly supports it. You have explicit support from the government, and then you also have coordination from the government. And I think most of the places that I've looked at are not any one of those categories, but some sort of combination of those two. So if you look at Sri Lanka, for instance, I think one of the biggest things that people pointed out to me, when I went to report on hate speech there on Facebook, is that essentially the government has been using traditional media platforms to kind of spread, incite hate in kind of possibly more subtle ways against ethnic minorities for ages and ages. And the kind of introduction of Facebook merely mirrored those kinds of dynamics onto a different kind of platform, which I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. And I think the biggest word that they use is impunity. And it's the idea that you can do these things and there's no real repercussions for doing it. So why wouldn't you sort of do it? And I think, you get another variant still in Myanmar where you have, there's on the one hand, there's a kind of cabal of right-wing Buddhist nationalist groups that are constantly on Facebook demonizing Rohingya people and Muslims in general in some cases, and essentially calling for them to be thrown out of the country or even killed. But on the other hand, you also have sitting lawmakers. We did an investigation where we collated thousands of Facebook posts that were made by sitting lawmakers in Rakhine State, which was the home of the Rohingya minority, and they were on there basically doing the exact same stuff as these right-wing nutcases were doing, and there was no accountability. And even beyond that, the sitting government in Myanmar, which is run by Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party, the NLD they're not the kind to go on Facebook and call for violence and that sort of thing. They're not going to do that. But at the same time, there have been no consequences for the people that have weaponized the platform to do that. Often very powerful people with lots of reach and lots of followers on their accounts. People are doing this in an environment of impunity, and I think that the kind of reasons for that are twofold. One is that there's no consequences from their own government, and the second is that there's no consequences from the platform. And I'll talk also finally just about Cambodia. Cambodia is a case where I think, at least at that time, Facebook had sort of unsuspectingly kind of fallen into a trap sort of set by the government. So essentially, Facebook had not paid that much attention to content on its platform that was written in Khmer, which is the language in Cambodia. And essentially Hun Sen, the prime minister of Cambodia, had set up this Facebook team, and I happened to interview like the head of his Facebook team, and he essentially had people sort of scattered throughout the country who were monitoring all of the Facebook content that was being produced in their localities and stuff like that, and they would send Facebook like examples of things that they thought had like violated their terms of service, and Facebook often would take the stuff down. So that sounds fair, right? Because it's Facebook's own terms of service, but in reality, Facebook is really reactive when it comes to this stuff. They're not really doing takedowns until people report them. So when you have like this kind of well-financed, like powerful apparatus that is systematically reporting content, they're much more likely to react to that kind of content than other stuff. And a lot of the things that people were doing, for instance, they might have been violations of Facebook's terms of service, but they weren't inherently malicious or anything. So like, for example, a lot of Cambodians on Facebook were using fake names. And if you're a Cambodian on Facebook, you would probably do the same thing, because remember, somebody is looking at your Facebook post, like from the government, to see what you have said, and you can be detained for something that you said on a public platform. So of course you're going to use a fake name, but Facebook doesn't allow fake names, right, on its platforms. So it would take those accounts down, and in doing that, it was sort of inadvertently suppressing critical speech at the behest of this government.
Let's maybe talk a little more, now that we're sort of slowly coming towards the end of this conversation, about solutions or possible solutions. I want to start with a question again submitted by somebody listening in on Zoom. Thank you for this. Do you think it's the responsibility of a company like Facebook or a country to detect crimes that have not been carried out yet? So very often, the example given here is, a suicide attack that would, theoretically have been noticeable and thus possibly preventable had one monitored sort of a social media account. But I guess there's other examples, such as kind of, coordination to, to do riots or whatever. So this seems like a tricky thing, because there's kind of like a balance between, what we call free speech and obviously kind of like the rule of law. So, what's a good point? Sort of what may be good rules to guide us here, and where do you see primary responsibility? Is it with those companies, or is it with lawmakers in respective countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think preventing crimes is a tough one, but I think the way to think about this is that inciting violence on a platform and is in and of itself a crime in many jurisdictions. It's not just the violence itself that is a crime. Actually, inciting violence is also a crime, right? So, like, for instance, if I like the classic U.S. example is shouting fire in a crowded theater, people are going to be trampled and stuff like that. It's not, even though the U.S. has the First Amendment, it's not legal to do that. I can't stand on a street corner in the U.S. and talk about murdering someone. Like, it just wouldn't. And like in most countries, even the ones that have very strong freedom of speech protections, that would also be the case. So I think that's one lens to look at it. But in reality, the way these debates actually play out on these platforms is a lot more nuanced. And that's why I think this question is good, because it's like, I mean, what do you call preventing a crime? So like, for instance, in Sri Lanka, I spent some time covering, I'll just do a very quick screen share. I spent some time covering the riots that had happened in Sri Lanka. These were kind of anti-Muslim riots that had happened kind of in the central part of the country, and had been spurred by this kind of nationalistic content that was put on Facebook. And what happened as a result of the riots, like if you can see this video, I'll just turn the sound off, but like you can see that this is a village where essentially all of the Muslim businesses were burned, and all of the Buddhist run businesses were left standing. So it was sort of very clear what the intent of them was. So I guess like, did Facebook have a responsibility to prevent this, right? The kind of content that was instigating the riots was put on their platform. There were videos, there were live streams of people saying, let's go to these villages and stuff like that. In that case, it seems pretty clear cut. But there's also, if you then trace it back like a few weeks before that, there was stuff that was a lot less clear cut. So like, for instance, like they were kind of recurring meme of the of anti-Muslim content in Sri Lanka is that Muslims are trying to sterilize Buddhists in some way and raise their own birth rates in a way, to take over the country or something like that. So there was a woman who posted, she essentially posted a video of her taking apart a bra. So she had slit this bra with a razor and she was pulling apart these kind of gel beads from the lining of the bra. And for me, looking at that as an outsider, I was like, how is this harmful? But in reality, anyone in Sri Lanka would know that what this person was alluding to was that the proprietor of the shop that sold the bra had put some sort of weird things in there that were going to damage the health of the woman who bought them, and like sterilize her or something. So I would never have gotten that, right? But if you went and read the comments, you would sort of know. So a lot of this stuff is really, really subtle, and it's sort of purposely subtle specifically to make it more difficult for content moderators, working for Facebook or Twitter or whatever, to be able to suss it out. So, I mean, it's tough, right? Like, where does responsibility lie in that case? Like, does Facebook have a responsibility to employ people with that kind of level of local knowledge that would be able to perceive that and pick up on the fact that it was, really hateful kind of content? I don't know. It's really tough. But I think the first kind of level to this is transparency. Like, if we're even at this stage where we're talking about, private companies having a responsibility to themselves prevent crime, that is a public function. That is something that we have to decide as a society, like, what level of transparency do we want over Facebook's own internal processes for doing that? Where should they be responsible? At what point do we want them to rope in law enforcement? These are all really tough questions.
Let's maybe end with a question that I think in some ways we've touched on before, but still, you just talked very convincingly, I think, of sort of the challenge of moderation. And even if these platforms, were perfectly willing to solve the problem, which I think in many cases we assume perhaps they're not, or at least they weren't at the beginning, that might change. But still, the scale of the problem is so big. So, all these sort of subtle changes, it's so hard to kind of have that knowledge at hand for like human content moderation to be always there in a timely and good manner. So obviously, technology has contributed to the problem. Do you see a way where technology can be part of the solution? So can we use technology, whether that's artificial intelligence or anything else, to get us to a place where content moderation is better and more effective, to get us to a place where these kind of sort of widespread misinformation campaigns on social media are not possible anymore, or at least more limited in scope?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, definitely. I think in the past couple of years, what we've seen is, because of the kind of public outcry that followed, the kind of rise of weaponized disinformation around 2016, the platforms have gone from saying, oh, we're like sort of neutral actors in this, to saying, okay, like we need to take a more active role, for better or for worse. That's sort of the trend that we're seeing. And I think they know that if they don't do that, A, users are going to become disenchanted with them, and B, like regulators are going to, like sort of around the world, are going to take more aggressive measures. So I think as a result of those two things, they're taking a more proactive stance. I think that the solution is not just an increase in moderation. I think that can be good, but ultimately we have to know who are the moderators and sort of what are the kind of precise tactics they're using. And there has to be a kind of, there has to be a system of like checks and balances, whether that means sort of outside entities examining how moderation works, especially when it's an algorithm doing the moderating and not a person. Or if it's, somebody who's had a post deleted or their account deleted, having a path to to question that decision, and all of these things I think need to be done. And I think that stuff will come with the recognition of I think how important social media companies are now in our lives, sort of irrevocably so, as sort of gatekeepers of speech. And I think that we have to start putting pressure on them to think about themselves in that way, and to sort of continue carrying that message forward. I also think that, I will say that I think like Facebook in particular has, and Google also have done a good job in sort of hiring more people kind of proficient in local languages to moderate some of this content. A lot of people would say, okay, well, it's still really not enough. That definitely may be true. I know, like Zuckerberg has said that they're pouring money into developing algorithms. I think on a kind of human level, because content moderation is so emotionally taxing and like psychologically taxing, it's definitely a positive thing that they're doing that. But it also leaves the question of, who is really overseeing these algorithms, since they are regulating all of our speech. Shouldn't there be some kind of like independent auditing of how this kind of stuff works? So I think that the real thing is to sort of for the platforms to continue recognizing that these problems exist, and kind of trying to take a more active stance in reducing them, and sort of making sure that their platforms are still being used for good, are not being weaponized by malicious actors, including governments that want to do harm to groups of people, and to sort of perceive their role as, as public goods as well as being for-profit companies.
All right. Megha Rajagopalan, thank you very, very much for joining us today for this conversation. This was very insightful. There would be a lot more to discuss, I'm sure, but for today, we've reached the end of our time. So thank you to you in London for joining us. And we do hope we get to see you actually live in Switzerland at some point this year. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and stay well, everybody.